Serious, people who were at Ground Zero on 9/11, what's your experience? Not my story, but they had an article today about a bunch of twists of date which kept people from dying that day. One guy was in his office in the towers and a client was having trouble signing in at the front desk down below. Normally that's something his assistant would handle, but she was like 8 months pregnant, so he decided to be nice and go down and handle it himself. He lived. She, and everyone else in his office, died. They had another woman who lived because she got fired less than 24 hours earlier from Cantor Fitzgerald. They hired her back after the attacks and she actually never went off the payroll because the HR people who would have processed her firing were killed in the attacks. It was my day off from college. Was sitting about to play a video game when I saw a plane had hit the tower. Didn't think anything of it until I watched that second plane hit the other tower. Got in my car and drove down to my firehouse that I had been swore into not 3 weeks before. Staged there for a while and was finally thrown into a truck to stage again at Westchester Fire Training Center. Staged there for what seemed like forever. We get the call that we are to head to Ground Zero to help with search and rescue. The whole area was very surreal. Dust and debris everywhere. It was pretty much organized chaos. I helped wherever I could and still remember the look of confusion, anger on everyone's face. My friend and my chief both told me since I was new not to take my mask off and to only breath bottled air. Hot change if you needed to. Both of them would end up taking their masks off to smoke. Both of them are no longer with us. My mother was an EMT in Northern NJ. She did not go, but coordinated her local volunteer first aid squad deploying a rig into Manhattan. One of her best friends was one of the ones who went. It was very traumatizing for EMTs and other rescue personnel that day and the days to follow. These people go into a situation with the idea that they're going to help people, they're at least going to get them to the hospital alive. After they arrived at the down towers, people still thought at first there would be some people to help under direction of NYPD and I don't even know who else. They spread out over the pile, trying to find people. At one point, my mom's friend saw a hand poking out and went eagerly running over to it, thinking she'd hold that person's hand while yelling for others to come and dig that person out. She crouched down and held the hand, and very quickly realized there was nothing attached to the hand. That was how things went for rescuers. By that first night, they pretty much knew it was, at best, going to be a recovery effort, not a rescue. The friend had a full-time job outside the home in addition to her volunteering with the first aid squad. She has not worked at her paying job, nor has she worked as an EMT since that day, and she has been in heavy-duty therapy ever since. I heard that PPL hid in what was left from the towers for the rescue dogs so they would not only find dead bodies, because they're not trained to only find dead persons, and I think that's the worst to think, well, we can bring some to the hospital and rescue their live but they mostly find death bodies. I watched the second plane hit from across the river in my school's library. It was such a clear day. I knew something was wrong, so I decided to just leave and go home. When the first plane hit, we thought it was an accident. On the way home, I was on the phone with my wife and she started screaming the towers collapsed over and over and I couldn't believe it. In my head I pictured them falling like dominoes. When I got home I immediately tried to get in touch with my dad. He worked in WTC and would have definitely been there at the time of the attack. He just so happened to take vacation that week. So lucky. I had tons of friends who worked downtown and thankfully none of them were injured. Some of them didn't make it home for hours and hours, having to walk across the bridge because public transportation was shut down. My neighbor died in the attack with a 2-year-old and a newborn at home. If they had tried crashing the planes an hour later it would have been much worse. A lot of people don't get to work in the city until 10 or so. I just don't like to think about it, and I wasn't even in Manhattan, so I can't even imagine how it affected people who were right there. Oh wow. So happy for you and your dad. My grandma used to see the towers clear as day from her window and I wished we took a picture of them. But she stood in shock as she saw both towers fall and couldn't eat for a day or two. The days and years following, I learned a lot about faith, destiny and even luck. Because I didn't know anyone personally who passed away that day, but I knew of people who supposed to go to work, but was sick, people who were running late, a cousin who was in the high school next to WTC but luckily was starting freshman year in upstate New York, friend's parent who supposed to take the plane that hit the towers, but missed the flight. To all the people who are grieving their loved ones who passed that day, may they never be forgotten. I'm up in Vermont, but one of my classmates' parents was an AA pilot whose route was Boston to LA. Fortunately, he wasn't flying any of those planes. My science teacher in 8th grade told us about how she was working at the WTC in Tower 1 and was late to work because she forgot to eat and stopped at McDonald's. The people ordering her food took their time, so she was a few minutes late. When she finally got her food and left, the bridge closed right as she got to it. She showed up to work and saw what was happening right in front of her as her husband was still in the building on floor 91. He sadly did not make it out alive, but if she hadn't stopped to eat that day, she wouldn't have made it either, and she is the sweetest, most caring person I have ever met in my life. Oh man, she must have been both relieved and heartbroken. I hope she's okay. Wasn't at Ground Zero, but watched from my corner in Brooklyn. The towers were so massive they looked like they were down the block on Metropolitan Avenue. It was a nightmare. I became physically ill watching the smoke. Then the fighter jets went overhead and I thought we were under attack, and God knows what was going to happen next. I ran to my dad's office nearby in Greenpoint and saw the first tower fall. I have chills typing this. I went into denial. I told myself the buildings were evacuated. I refused to believe I just witnessed all those innocent people die. My best friend worked in the financial district. She had to walk over the bridge to Brooklyn, where my dad drove us back to Queens. We were in shock. Just the radio on in the car. It was so surreal. So many rumors of a dirty bomb coming next and fear that bridges would be blown up next. The following months were just as trying. I was a student in Gramercy Park, and every day I would pass missing people posters. You knew they wouldn't be found. That last line gave me chills more than anything else in this thread. Thank you for your story. Was across the river in NJ and had a late start. I was heading to Long Island but got held up because all the bridges were closed. All the payphones and cell phones were down, so I headed home on RT80 West. The only vehicles going eastbound were ambulances from every town in northern NJ, Dover, Newton, Denville, Hackettstown and all the rest. It really hit home for me seeing that. I wasn't at the Ground Zero, but I was at a Ground Zero in a sense. I was in middle school at the time, in New York, but my middle school high school was on top of a hill that on a clear day easily saw the Manhattan skyline. Plus, a huge chunk of my school was made up with families of people who worked in the finance industry, an industry heavily present in the WTC in NYC, including several students who had either brothers, cousins or parents who worked above the floors where the planes hit. I don't remember the exact numbers, but a giant chunk of my class lost someone. There are certain people you'd never expect to see cry, bullies. Big guys just absolutely lose it. It's honestly hard to write about without tearing up a bit. The crazy thing was, we could just make out the sky filling up with smoke and obscure the city, like a sideways volcano was about to blow. I just remember as the news broke. For me, it was told to me by a friend who was horribly unreliable, and as such I didn't believe him, and students would just break down as they realized with certainty that they had someone close to them die. It was a small school. Each grade had maximum 150 people, but by the end of the day there was maybe 50 students left in the whole school who hadn't been taken home for one reason or another. We who were left had all gathered in the auditorium. My dad at the time worked in the top chunk of the Empire State Building. I was terrified that building would get hit too. It seemed like just as good a target as any, and my dad would definitely be the sort of person who would have just worked through. Instead, he pulled up to pick me up from school in a stretch limo. As he was desperately trying to get out of Manhattan, he made the realization that no one would probably hail a limo. He was mostly right. 2 other people ended up sharing it with him, and made the long journey up out through one of the only bridges open into the Bronx and back down into Long Island. Instead, he pulled up to pick me up from school in a stretch limo. As he was desperately trying to get out of Manhattan, he made the realization that no one would probably hail a limo. He was mostly right. 2 other people ended up sharing it with him. This is such an interesting detail. Very level-headed of him. I wasn't at Ground Zero but at my school in Alexandria. The lesser-known crash at the Pentagon was felt like an earthquake that lasted for like 15 seconds. The whole city was shaking. Every TV in the school building was turned onto a news channel. Parents were called to pick up the kids. I walked home because I lived 1 block from school. Was on the R train when the first plane hit. Ended up being delayed due to smoke conditions at Cortlandt Street. Got to the office in downtown Brooklyn and saw what was happening on TV. Went up to another office and we watched the towers collapse out the window. My office was close to the Brooklyn Bridge, so the rest of the day was thousands of people covered in ash walking by like zombies. Went out with the bar that night in Bay Ridge with the boys. Every church was packed, it was just surreal. Lots of police and firefighter families in that neighborhood. My dad worked close to Ground Zero and he worked nights. He'd see the trailers they were using to store the bodies in every night. Over the next few years I walked by Ground Zero hundreds of times for work. It was strange and magnificent in its own fricked up way. You'd be walking on a regular city block and then boom, a crater in the middle of the city. I understand what you mean. It's like the destruction after a hurricane. Chaotically beautiful and fricked up at the same time. I wasn't in New York, but my grandpa was the chief engineer building manager for the Sears Willis Tower at the time. Everyone in the building was ordered to evacuate since Sears was a very likely target, being the tallest building in the country at the time. My grandpa and his crew were the only people allowed to stay in the building and he offered his people the option to go home. Only one person went home and the rest stayed. My grandpa is also notorious for not using the phone, so my grandma had some pretty choice words for him when he got home. It was one of my first memories. A week before I started kindergarten, I was sitting on the couch watching a Mary-Kate and Ashley show. My mum was in the kitchen making a bottle for one of my 2 baby siblings. The phone rang. Suddenly my show was interrupted. In that moment I was furious. My mum walked in. She was silent. I remember watching the towers fall. I remember every time I closed my eyes I'd see them fall. I remember the first day of kindergarten we sat in a circle and talked about it. I was lucky. I was one of the kids that didn't lose anyone. I don't remember much besides that. My mum told me that for weeks afterwards I'd build towers and kick them down. My dad worked on Wall Street, but not in the towers. He and his friends helped his pregnant boss down the stairs of their building because their elevators were shut off. This was right after the second tower was hit. By some miracle they found her a cab. He ran from 8 miles from Wall Street back to our apartment. He didn't see the towers fall. He wasn't raised religiously, but he said that he was scared to look back. He was afraid he'd turn into a pillar of salt. When he got home the soles of his shoes were worn out. He sat on the couch, head in his hands for hours. I think about it a lot. My fury at the TV interruption. My parents' silence. My family is not American. They didn't want to move to America, and they didn't plan on staying, but they did. Something changed that day. It was like we all suddenly realized that every ounce of control we believed we had over ourselves was a lie. I wasn't there, but my dad was. He was in the North Tower with his buddy when the first plane hit. We didn't even receive the news about the planes hitting until around 4 hours later because we were all sick at home, asleep. I was too young to realize how bad it really was, but it still hurts. I can remember my mom being completely devastated when she received the news that he wasn't coming home. We never got his body back, so we had nothing to bury. I am extremely sorry for your loss. I was not at Ground Zero on 9/11. I was on a USAF base in Milwaukee, just hanging around the shop because none of our 12 C-130 aircraft were broke, so it was normal to stay in the shop and do miscellaneous work. We get a call that a plane hit the first tower. We gathered around the break room TV in time to see the horror of the second plane hitting the second tower. The base went into threat condition black. All gates closed and secured. We quickly assisted the base security forces set up a sandbag fighting position on the roof of the main entrance building. 2 .50 caliber machine guns were swiveling at any vehicle coming close to the base. We headed back to the shop and every maintainer was on the flight line getting our mighty C-130s ready for the call. Within a few days we were airdropping ammo, weapons, troops and equipment in Afghanistan ahead of the special operations guys to start kicking asses. I'll never forget how everything changed that day. Not my story, but in college I toured EDC with my choir and stayed with a man who worked in the Pentagon on 9/11. He said that the building shook and the lights flickered, but since he was on the opposite side of the building, he and his co-workers didn't know what happened until they were told to evacuate the building. He walked halfway home before finding out what happened. He finished his career at the same desk and still lives a short walk away. Standing outside my Arlington Middle School, you could smell the burning Pentagon when you stepped outside, a slight smoky tinge in the air. I wasn't, but my uncle was. He worked for Lehman Brothers and could see what was happening from his office. They were evacuated after the second plane and there was a ton of miscommunication, people saying that the Washington Monument had been hit, that sort of thing. He couldn't get in touch with my aunt because all the lines were busy. When the towers fell, he ran for his life and managed to get out of way before anything got to him. He wrote a book based on these experiences later on. One of my relatives is a flight attendant for United, but I don't think she was working that day. Another relative was working on the crisis response team for United. He was sent up to Pennsylvania to survey the damage and ending up having to take a bus home to his wife 3 states away because all the planes were grounded. I've talked to him about it since, and while it's fascinating to hear, the impact is profound and damaging. If you ever travel to O'Hare International Airport, there is a banner memorializing the flight crews lost on 9/11. I was going to school in North New Jersey and I was in the 5th grade. I remembered I was on my way to school seeing smoke from the window of my bus. I thought it was just a big fire and just ignored it until I got to my school and our homeroom teacher announced the Twin Towers were struck by a plane and we were sent home. On the way out from the school, I remember seeing some teachers and kids frantic as they had relatives or close friends who were in the area. I was able to just go outside from my grandparents' apartment in Edison and still see the smoke all day. Very wild and sad day. My mom picked me up from school in Metuchen and I just remember thinking how cool it was that I could hear the planes flying so low. I was in a college psych class in Midtown, heard about what was happening and went out to look in time to see the second tower fall. Pretty surreal experience. That night Manhattan was silent aside from an occasional siren, which was eerie. Got evacuated late at night to the river because my dorm was near the Empire State Building and they thought there might be a threat. I don't remember if it was the night of 9/11 or the following night. Woke up the morning of 9/12 sobbing and despondent. We still thought the death toll might be 10,000 at that point. Things were weird. I went down to Ground Zero to volunteer a few times, as a way to deal with it. In some ways I think I got over it more because I was there and it was actually real. But nobody I knew personally was killed, and it wasn't just an image on a TV screen. I was just a kid when 9/11 happened, and so it was kind of hard for me to comprehend the actual mass destruction that was caused on that day. But I have heard my dad's story nowadays, so I will tell it here. So my dad was in the Air Force at the time, and he was in Northern NJ on base. When there were ambulances and fire trucks racing towards NYC, he became worried, and when he saw on every TV in the base showing live footage of the crazy things going on, when to his horror he watched the second plane hit the South Tower. His mom had gone to NYC the day before for the week, and today was the day she was going to the towers to see them in all their glory. He had been frantically trying to reach her but she never picked up. We later found out that she had been in the second tower, 27th floor, when the second plane hit. She let everybody go down in the elevator before she did, and as she was going down the elevator with the last group the tower crumbled. While cleaning up Ground Zero, the police found her body under a lot of rubble. They then called my dad 2 weeks later with the info that his mom was dead. He said that was one of the last days he ever cried. Being in the Air Force made it so he had to go to Afghanistan after the attacks. So he had to leave our family for 3 months, and that time his squad was attacked over 4 times. He got leave because half his squad was either injured or killed, so he got lucky and was given administrative leave. Sorry that this is such a long post, but I thought that it was worthy of the full story. Thanks for anyone that stuck with the post and read it all. I'm extremely sorry for your loss. I grew up in a suburb of Manhattan in Rockland County. I was a sophomore in HS and I remember being in 4th period chem when our teacher told us what happened. Weirdly enough, next period, that teacher tried to say it wasn't real and probably didn't happen. My mom came to pick me up early the next period, so I knew it was real. For a second I was so scared she was there to tell me something happened to my dad, but he worked in Midtown so he was okay. He commuted into the city and would park in the Bronx, then take the subway down. Because all mass transit was down, he had to walk over 100 blocks to his car so he could drive through Westchester and cross the Tappan Zee Bridge home. He doesn't really talk about it, but has said everyone was just so quiet on the walk uptown. My English teacher's sister's fiance was in one of the towers and did not make it out. Her sister was supposed to get married that weekend. An ambulance had to take my teacher out of school because she was so distraught that she couldn't get a hold of him. She was absent for most of the rest of the school year. Many kids in my school and rest of the school district lost family members that day. I just remember knowing what happened, but not understanding the gravity of the situation and how many people were in the towers. In my naive mind, I thought the Twin Towers were just landmarks. I didn't know people worked there. I couldn't really believe it happened, and especially so close to home, until I got home and watched the news, and I remember my mom just crying silent tears. Then, all I wanted to do was help. I remember the charity drives and donations every weekend for months. The lines around the block just to drop stuff off at whatever fire station. I went to college in the city and my freshman year. In September I went downtown to see Ground Zero, but it was all fenced up. I looked through the slats and it was just a gaping hole. It was kind of bizarre to see that large of an empty space in the city, but it looked so ominous. One of the families I babysat for a long time after that, the husband worked in one of the towers and made it out. I asked his wife once how it was for him and how he was able to get out, and she said he refuses to talk about it because it is too traumatizing. I don't know if anyone is aware of the story of the man with the red bandana. He was from a neighboring town of mine. I didn't know him or his family as he was a bit older than I was, but he helped so many people that day, and so many are alive because of him. They used to have fundraisers in his name every year to help the families of 9/11. Every year on this day, I love to read stories like all of these, and watch films or look at pictures to remind myself of the atrocities, almost as a way to pay my respects to those who lost their lives, and my own personal way of never forgetting. I was not at Ground Zero, but I was 4 years old and watching on TV from Florida. I remember watching it and thinking my mom was just watching an intense movie. I didn't connect the dots until I was about 9 or 10 years old. I remember watching it and my mother saying, "Oh my god, they're jumping." I didn't realize what was falling wasn't debris, so I didn't think anything of it, but now that the dots have connected, I still hear her voice saying that every time I think of 9/11. I remember watching the second plane crash. I went to the memorial at Ground Zero when I was 18 and it reminded me of everything from when I watched it. All I kept hearing was, "Oh my god, they're jumping." Seeing the location in person was more than surreal. I was paralyzed in place at certain points because it became suddenly more real to me. Just remember that some of the kids do remember. And to anyone that reads this that was a first responder, thank you for your service. To those that sacrificed their time to help clear it all, thank you. To those who lost family friends, my sincerest condolences, and I pray for you all of the time. God bless you all. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.